Right, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jessica Cecil. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Aging Research Institute. Welcome to our online Seminars in Aging program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us are meeting today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Firstly, a little housekeeping regarding Zoom. At the conclusion of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can submit them throughout the seminar using the chat function, which can be opened using the chat tab at the bottom of your screen. Today, we'll be hearing from Sam Edmonds and Sally Goldner. Sam Edmonds is the Manager of Policy and Systemic Advocacy at the Older Persons Advocacy Network and the Managing Director of Aging with Pride. Sam is a distinguished member of the Australian Association of Gerontology, convener of the AAG LGBTI Special Interest Group, and convener of the AAG Elder Abuse Special Interest Group. She is partner in the Rainbow Aging Project. Sally Goldner is a founding member of Transgender Victoria, presenter of 3 CRs Out of the Pan, co-facilitator of Trans Family, and treasurer of the Bisexual Alliance Victoria. She was inducted into the Victorian Women's Honour Roll in 2016, awarded LGBTI Victorian of the Year in 2015, and awarded the Order of Australia Medal in 2019. Today, they're going to be presenting LGBTIQA plus aging and aged care. So welcome, Samantha and Sally, and over to you.
Where the other ones were, like print new ones. So just.
Thank you. Someone was not on mute.
Yep.
Words of the 2020s.
Yep. So Sally will start off, and then we'll go as we go. And please feel free to ask questions as we go along as well. Thanks, Sally.
Yeah. Look, I just wanted to bounce off the asking questions. So long as it honestly comes from a place of asking to learn, we find in this area that sometimes people can hesitate about asking questions because, oh, I don't want to say anything offensive, and then they don't ask. You've got to ask us. That's why we're here. And the good thing is, even if there's a better way to have asked the question, you get a bonus set of cutlery. Not only do you get the answer, you get a better way to ask the question as well. So please, don't hesitate. Pop your questions in the chat as we go, or the Q&A, or whatever it is, and we'll get to them towards the end. And of course, we'll acknowledge that we're all meeting on Aboriginal lands. Oh, look, we're synchronising already. Seriously, of course, we acknowledge acknowledge Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging, any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people on the Zoom today, and that all the lands were stolen and never ceded. And I today am on Kulin Nation's land, in particular the Bolin, which translates to, has been anglicised, into Bulleen, a suburb about 15 kilometres east of what is now called the Melbourne CBD. Sam.
And I'm sitting on the lands of the Gundungurra and Darug peoples in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales. And I too would like to acknowledge their continuing connection to this country and acknowledge this land was never ceded as well. Yeah. So who are LGBTIQA plus peoples? I know everyone is probably very familiar with the rainbow flag and sort of associates that with LGBTIQA plus people. And some of you may be familiar with the trans flag and the intersex flag and possibly the bisexual flag. But there are so many more different sexualities, genders and identities out there. And this is just a small collection of some of the different flags representing that broader group of people that we're trying to talk about today. While the rainbow flag is the most dominant one and the one used sort of to cover everybody, it's really important to recognise that different groups have actually created their own flags to celebrate their own identities.
Yeah, it's a really good point. We say LGBTIQA plus peoples or communities, or I'm naturally open about my identity. In terms of gender identity, I use the term trans woman. For sexual/romantic orientation, I use the terms bi and pan. And even in referring to one, we can talk about bi plus communities. Yep, whole range of flags. And I'll just sort of move to one side. You can see in the background of my Zoom. You can see the pan flag there, the darker blue, yellow, and sort of richer pink, lighter blue, pink, and white of the trans, and down below the rainbow. And so we've already got onto a really practical hint of, and it's a bit chilly down here on these lands today, so I've got a rainbow scarf on. Things like this can really communicate your support, regardless of your own sense of self or experience of our communities, as we are on online so much at this time. Oh, and also the higher up flags cover up my coat rack. You don't want to see that.
Love it. So when we're talking about LGB, queer, asexual, aromantic, plus all the other different sexualities, we're actually talking about sexualities, attractions, and relationships. So it's not always about being in a relationship. It's not always about a sexual relationship. It could simply be an attraction. So that's a really important thing to just think about and remember, that people might not necessarily be actively engaged in that type of relationship, even though they identify within that particular group. So if you look at the different definitions here, we say someone who identifies as, has romantic and or sexual relationships with and or is attracted to. So it's trying to capture that broader understanding of how people identify themselves or describe themselves. Then we go sort of, as we go down from lesbian and gay and bisexual. Queer, it's used in a very personal way, in a variety of ways, and it's often really important to talk to someone to understand what queer means to them, because it can mean different things for different people. It's not an umbrella term, so it's not something that you use to describe all the diverse sexualities, and it's certainly for older LGBTIQA plus people, it's not language that they tend to use to describe themselves. Queer often had a very detrimental and derogative term as they grew up, so it's not a term that they will use comfortably or will necessarily feel happy about being applied to them. Asexual is around not experiencing sexual attraction. Aromantic is low levels of romantic attraction. And then the plus generally acknowledges that people use alternative labels, and that's becoming more and more common, particularly amongst younger generations. They're sort of trying to find different ways to identify themselves more accurately. So pansexual instead of bisexual, non-binary instead of trans, grey ace instead of asexual. So the language is changing all the time, and that can sometimes be difficult for people. So that's why it's so important to have conversations with people to find out how they identify themselves. And I'll just flip back quickly to bisexual. Quite often people think bisexual means that you're equally attracted to men and women, and that it's like a 50-50 split, but it's not. For some bisexuals, they're more attracted to women than men. For others, attracted more to men than women. Others, it may be more towards trans men or trans women than cis women. So it's actually a very broad term, and it's not a neat 50-50 split. And so it's, if say for myself, being married, oh, well, you're married, so that so obviously you're just heterosexual now. Well, no, that it's just, that's who ended up falling in love with, and that's who I'm spending my life with. But that doesn't change my sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. Another way to look at bisexual, if you're wanting to look at another way, another colleague and I made up the idea of dating by flowchart, which is for lesbian, gay and heterosexual. So let's say you're a lesbian. Is the person I'm looking at a woman? No, stop looking. Yes, keep looking. And then you find out if you've got things in common. By people, that first sort of yes or no isn't quite there. So really important. And Sam touched on one of the stereotypes bi people face. Another can be, you haven't made up your mind, get off the fence, those sorts of things. Bi people have made up our minds. We're just attracted to where gender's not the first thing we automatically look for. And as we also like to say, get on the fence, the view's better. And asexual, not my lived experience, but a couple of things there. We have all sorts of assumptions about whether people are sexual or not, or should be, or can be, or how much they can be. So asexual people, but including older people where this might cross over into a form of elder abuse, might be told, oh, well, how do you know you don't like sex if you've never had it, or things like that. or they're often asked to prove their sense of identity by health professionals, and that's of course very unaffirming. You know, and also older people might be told, oh, you're going to become asexual after a certain age because you stop having sex, and of course so long as sex is safe, consensual, of appropriate age, that's what matters. And aromantic, just the sort of parallel low to no levels of romantic attraction, and again so long as it's safe, consensual connection, that's the main thing. So just a few dot points to bounce off that one.
So this is a little map that is available online from ILGA World, and it's basically just to give you some ideas about what people LGBTIQA plus people face across the world. And when you're working with people from these cultures within our country, it's really important to understand the countries and the cultures from which they've come from, and what being in this particular around sexual orientation, what being LGB might mean in those countries and how that might impact on their lives. I'm not sure how clear it is on your screens. I'm sorry, I'm turning my pictures on a big screen to my right so I can read it a bit more easily. The dark browny kind of colour, that is where people, LGBT people, can still face the death penalty. So we know in 6 countries it's absolute, and in 5 countries it's probable. So if they are discovered, that they will probably face death penalty. The sort of tomatoey red is around 10 years to life imprisonment, and that's 27 countries. Up to 8 years imprisonment is the orange, and that's in 30 countries. De facto criminalisation, so just because you're LGB just happens, then therefore you're a criminal, that's in 2 countries, and that's kind of the slightly lighter orange. And then no protection, but again, not necessarily a criminal offence in 43 countries. The problem with that is because there's no protection, things can happen and people can end up in prison in those countries simply because they're not protected in any other way, or they can face harassment and abuse from authorities. If you flick down to the other end, the white, light blue, medium blue, dark blue, still sort of a fairly smaller percentage of the world offers protection to people of diverse sexual identities. So we've got 81 countries that at least offer employment protection, and that's the lighter blue colour. The medium blue colour is broad protection, so that might be laws in place, like in Australia, where we have particular legislation that provides particular protections. But only 11 countries actually offer constitutional protection. So LGBT people are actually recognised within their constitutions.
Yeah, I think there's a few points out of there. There's possibly some, sort of debate about this. I could take the whole hour telling you about a trip to Russia that I had in 2015. And I mean, it's been classified as no protection, no criminalisation, but of course they've got these so-called propaganda laws and not communicating to minors, which makes it incredibly difficult. And after coming from where I live, the relatively safe place, very welcoming place that is, say, metropolitan Melbourne, it was a shock. And it reminds us of why we are here today in a way I think that's really important. The other point I'd make is this is only covering sexual orientation, and largely the LGB at that. If we were to perhaps do a similar sort of map for trans, we'd notice a shift down the scale, and probably even more so for intersex, which we're going to come to. So I think that that's always worth keeping in mind, but it is of relevance, therefore, for your clients, and possibly maybe if you have a diverse workforce, maybe sometimes people have, come up with attitudes that, that's where they've come from. Okay, but then they might need, sort of education on those things. So I'm going to talk to this one from lived experience, or as we even like to call it sometimes, lived expertise is a term that a colleague of mine introduced me to a few years ago, and I think it is an expertise to have a diverse background. And so gender identity not typically associated with someone's assigned sex at birth. So what do we mean by that? I'll use myself as a quick straw case, so to speak. Child is born, separate from parent, hold up child, and in just over 49% of cases, not 50, we'll come to intersex in a second, we'll go, aha, that's what we call a male body. Yes, put M on a birth certificate, assign at birth. And then just over 49% female. But coming back to me, if I'm using myself as the straw case, we then put, you might say, expectations on people, not typically associated. So what is typically associated, I will be assumed that I will see myself as a boy or a man if I was sort of looking inside myself, so to speak, and how I express myself outwards, obvious things like clothing or, sort of hairstyle, but maybe other things like how I talk or how I stand that are a little more subtle gender expression would be what society, will say rightly or wrongly, decides to lump as masculine. Trans and gender diverse people just don't fit those expectations. And it's a bit much to think that of, where are we now, 7.9 billion people on the planet, roughly nearly 4 billion are going to just all be exactly the same in one box and 4 billion in another, in simple terms. So yeah, we're all somewhat different. Sometimes there's some obvious similarities in these areas, but others. And as said there, it's a separate component, or separate gender identity and expression are separate components of people. And so, yeah, we're all these whole multiple sort of components, the same as we all have other multiple components such as religion or faith, including none at all, suburb we live in, municipality, etc. There's lots of terms in this area, and in all of these, our stuff today, the term people use is their own. It's often very heartfelt. So if someone tells you their term, reflect it back. It's a good rapport builder. These are just some. Genderqueer is one term for people who identify, we'll say, beyond male or female. Some people have no gender identity at all. Agender is one term that gets used. We acknowledge, as we did in Acknowledgement of Country, on some of the lands that make up what I call this extended archipelago, there are people including sister girls and brother boys. And as it says there, brother boys, someone assigned female at birth, but live as male and of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander background and sort of parallel sister girl. And two-spirit is another term from the Americas, that North America and Central America in particular, which sort of covers this area as well. There's many others, the Fa'afafine in Samoa, the Buji in Indonesia, Hijra in South Asia, just to name a few. So a whole range of people, and just proves that there's been all sorts of ways to do your identity, gender identity, and express your gender since the human race began. Here is a good example of it.
And as Sally was saying and talking about the different cultures that have different gender identities, again, this is available online if you want to access it. And it's a simple map of the world showing all the different cultures that have multiple gender identities. So for Australia, within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, there's 4, as Sally discussed, so the sister girls, brother boys, male and female. And then in some cultures, there's up to 5 different gender identities. So it's something that's not unique, because sometimes you hear that it's a Western concept or it's a Western thing, but it's not. It's certainly been throughout history, throughout cultures and throughout the world, there have been trans and gender diverse people, and they've been recognised and often play really important roles within their cultures and communities.
Yeah, that map, if you put PBS, that which stands for Public Broadcasting Service for America, PBS Interactive Gender Map into your search engine, it usually comes up pretty quickly. And as said, you can click and find out more about lots of humans.
Yes, that's right. Yes, if you click on the little blue points, it'll explain who that is. So it's really good.
Mm. So intersex, that going back to that that moment of birth where, as I said, 49% are male, 49% female. About 1.7% of people, when the child is held up, there can be that pause, not sure, hang on a second. And so intersex people with intersex experience, bodies that don't fit medical norms. And that's really all it is. It's just, human diversity is what it is. Medicine wants to lump us in, our bodies, in that box or that box. And there are many kinds of bodies and experiences. And whilst that's the most commonly talked about part in terms of visibility, because it is obviously visible at birth, the part that perhaps don't get talked about is that you can have different hormones or chromosomes to what might be expected. Hormones might become obvious at puberty. Chromosomes, one that can happen, couples trying to have children, not working out, go off to fertility clinic to have chromosome tests, and someone comes back with an X chromosome or XXY. It's an equally valid human body, just different to what we expect in a way. So it's about bodily diversity, and it's yet another component of humans. So it's not sexual or romantic orientation, it's not gender identity or expression. So it's again part of that human tapestry. Sam.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to take on, is too often we see intersex people either lumped, if I can use that language, lumped into questions on sex. So you're male, female or intersex, or they're included under questions of gender, when it is something very, very separate. It is about their bodies, and that they can have any variety of sexual orientation and gender identity as the rest of the community. So that's just something really important to think about in terms of forms, in terms of discussions, and that being aware that intersex is about the body diversity only.
Yeah, I'm going to bounce exactly off what you've said there about forms. I think probably worth saying, well, how then do we collect data? The first thing always to ask is, do we need to collect something? So, really, I'll be a bit exaggerated, but let's say for some reason you're a librarian and you needed to collect data for someone's library card. You would just want to know their gender identity. You don't obviously need to know about the person's body. But about 12 months ago, I was approached by a sexual health organisation. And of course, that's where we probably do need to know about people's body, because it's about, quite reasonably, what sort of sex we're having. So always check in. But if you do need to ask, we often find that you might want to say, if you have to ask, how were you assigned at birth? You might want to put on a paper, best option is to have blank line and optional on a piece of paper. But if it's drop-down boxes, something like male, female, please specify and then allow free form, or prefer not to specify. And lots of databases nowadays on all of these things are allowing for infinite options. It's obviously much easier to do it that way, and then people can use the words that they feel comfortable with, which is very affirming. And similar issues apply for sexual orientation, gender identity, making sure you've got that other, or sort of please specify in free form and then prefer not to specify. As far as we can tell, you've got 100% of the population covered.
Great.
Sam.
Thank you.
Back to you.
So as we've sort of spoken about, or just sort of briefly touched on in some of that, the sort of definitions and identities, older LGBT Australians in particular have lived most of their lives aware that disclosing their sexual orientation, their gender identity, could result in punishment, could result in imprisonment, maybe psychiatric incarceration, and obviously enforced attempted cure treatments, most often electrotherapy. So they've grown up in a time where they did hide themselves. They didn't feel comfortable talking about who they were. They didn't want to talk about who they were because of that fear of the environment, groups of people that they were close to, that they were open and out with, but definitely not in broader community to institutions or government bodies. If they did disclose, of course, they could lose family, friends, housing, employment, huge impact on their lives and their livelihood. So that experience of growing up in a society that is so exclusive, so exclusive and so excluding, and that is has so much discrimination in it, has actually contributed to higher rates of depression and anxiety amongst LGBT people. And that is not because they are LGBT, but because of their life experiences has impacted on their mental health and well-being. And it's really unfortunate, and I still see this in the work I do and talking with older LGBT people, is that they still believe that they should hide their sexual identity or their gender identity because it might offend someone else, and they don't want to end up in a confrontational situation or a potentially threatening situation by actually acknowledging who they are.
Yeah, just to expand on those points, the thing is there that sometimes, with dry humour, if one is silly enough to listen to talkback radio, you might hear things like, "Oh, you got marriage equality 4 years ago. Isn't it all better now?" Well, yes, that was important to achieve, in our opinion, but it doesn't get rid of the paradigm that gets put into your life over many, many years. It might ease it, but it may not completely, or say, uproot that and go, "Oh, yeah, everything's all cool now," at all. And I think that that last point is pertinent. We can sadly set a low bar for ourselves. Yes, it's shifting, but you might hear someone tell you a story if they feel comfortable to disclose to you, about an experience. You might think, "Oh my goodness." And also, a lot of discrimination can happen one-on-one. We can't walk around with a sort of small webcam on our head filming everything, and then people will deny what happened. "Oh, I didn't say that." "Oh, you misheard me." "No, I didn't mean it." All those sorts of things. And when it happens repeatedly, it can really run you down. So, mental and physical sense and emotional, that sort of thing. So I think it's really important to look at the effects of these. The positive is by using some of the inclusive tips we're talking about, showing your support and then putting it into action, whether it's a flag in the background, scarf, whatever it is, that can be a real big lifter, can get us out of the downward spiral and into an upward spiral. So really important to be aware of that paradigm and then how you can sort of work through, over, around, under it. Sam.
Great. So obviously that lifetime has then led to and Sally's actually touched on it under that slide, that kind of expectation. So we know older LGBTQIA+ people are not comfortable disclosing, as I said, and that is around maintaining safety. So they'll often remain hidden in services, in research, in organisations, because there's nothing there that makes them feel safe or that they can actually explain or identify who they are. They absolutely fear and, as Sally talked about before, expect discrimination, a lesser standard of care, or just an outright refusal of service. They also expect, or we also expect, to be treated differently to non-LGBTIQA+ people, or not have different needs recognised, or different experiences recognised. It's like, "Oh, everyone's had a little bit of a bad experience in their life, get over it and get on with it." And it's not that type of experience, and people don't sort of that kind of dusting off or pushing to one side as if anyone's experiences are all identical, and we know they're not, and we know they impact people differently. The other really important thing is around family structures. Many LGBTIQA+ people create families of choice, and there may be biological family members in that family of choice, but there will also be friends, extended family, other people that they know that form that family of choice. And quite often that group, that family, doesn't get recognised, or the biological family steps in and intervenes in any supports or anything that they want. So really important to be aware and to discover who the family of choice is, of the people within your services or people that you're working with or dealing with, and making sure that they have the correct legal documentation in place, so that biological family members who may have nothing to do with that person can't step in over that person's decisions.
Yeah. So family of choice, most people, if they're asked, let's say in an employment situation, and you're asked to put down someone, you'll put a partner or maybe a parent, is two that obviously would come up. Something that can really help, and this actually will link into in a way to the question that's come up in the chat, or multitask, so to speak, is we'd much rather see a form that has contact person or maybe emergency contact, rather than next of kin, brother, sister, father, mother, partner, husband, divorced, whatever else. So an open field, contact person, name, phone number. I'm not sure if we asked for TikTok account. No, that's not true. Seriously, name, and then relationship /S to person, to staff member, or person in care, or whatever it is. I'll use myself as a straw case there. Yes, I get on really well with the two closest surviving family members that I have, my dad and my sister, but they don't know everything about my life. And also, I suppose, adding in these times, not so much aged care, but let's say I'm a little careless crossing the road or whatever, or I sprain my ankle, I have to go into hospital. My dad and my sister are on the Gold Coast and Brisbane respectively, and of course at the moment they couldn't get down to assist me, so it would be very difficult. And my dad's 86, so I have, and I'll call this first person Joanne, because that's not her name, and if I saw a field like that, I'd be able to put in medical attorney, power of attorney, executor, best friend, or one of best friends, also committee member on Bisexual Alliance Victoria. Now, you've just got a whole whack of information that will enable you to find more connections. And so, if it's power of attorney, she'll know, well, yes, Sally's lawyer is blah, that sort of thing. The second person is someone who will be listed as housemate, friend, fellow animal lover. So she'll know where my pajamas are in the bedroom and bring in a picture of the dog, something like that, which is much better than having my dad try to come down here, stress out, trying to ruffle through my room or whatever it is. So this is where we see these things. It's really important. That's where I'll link this into our question in the chat, how to ask. Something like, who are the important people in your life? Is really important to, open questions are really good. And I think I'll say it's best not to ask, are you LGBTIQA plus or something like that? It's too direct for us most of the time. So just saying, who are the important people in your life? Having these forms that are inclusive, they're still going to put you ahead of the pack and compared to most. And, giving these subtle communicators, they're the sort of things we'll look for. Can just say, okay, here's someone safe to disclose to, and someone will say, oh, there's my friend from the gay support group, or whatever it is. So yeah, open questions that are broad and inclusive are probably the overarching tip. Sam.
Great, thanks, Sally. And I guess just sort of continuing that reflection on history is, people tend to think that the life experiences of LGBTIQA plus people are, it's ancient history, and it's not ancient history. It's all very much recent history. And if we look at a little timeline we've put together, and if you think of someone who was born in 1920, say, so when they're 13 years old, there's the outbreak of war, and we have what's called the Pink Triangle. And not many people know that Nazi concentration camps actually had a pink triangle badge to identify male prisoners who were actually sent there because they were homosexual or gay. And the other side of that is when the concentration camps were released, many of those people ended up back in prison in Germany because it was still illegal. So that's sort of the starting point, I guess, if you like. So for this person's life journey, so they're 13, they've got a bit of an understanding of the world, they know they're gay, and this is what they're seeing in the world around them. In the 50s to 80s, you could still be sent to be cured of your homosexuality. So again, ECG, electrotherapy, electric shock therapy, and your person's in their 30s now. In 1973, finally, homosexuality is no longer a mental disorder, and the person's 53 years old. In 1997, Tasmania, the last state in Australia to decriminalise, and this person is now 67 years old. It wasn't until 2009 that we finally recognised family relationships across Australia, and that was the Same-Sex, Same Entitlements report from the Human Rights Commission. And then in 2012, we had the LGBTI ageing and aged care strategy. So the first time that the needs and issues of older LGBTI people are actually acknowledged and recognised. And that person, at that stage, a person's 92 years old. So this whole lifetime of experiences, and it's not till they're just about, or maybe they are accessing aged care, that finally their rights as an older person are recognised. And then there's a little bit, there's other stuff going on between 2012 and 2018, but the next big step is the diversity framework and the LGBTI aged care action plans. Again, guidelines rather than requirements to help providers. Sal, did you?
Yeah, look, I think that the broad brushstrokes there, the thing that I'd pull if I was looking at that holistically is there's been a lot of focus on relationships, which is great, which is more the LGB, but there's been less on trans, speaking from my own experience. So, for example, we still have only 5 out of 8 of the Australia's states and territories with what I will call, in my words, above pass marks birth certificate laws, for example, that don't require surgery. And that's been from 2014 through to 2020. So 3 still require surgery, which, or one is, there's some questions, but it's not clear in the law. It's not as positive as it could be. And then going beyond my experience, there has been not really any intersex specific reform, although there is now looking like there's some movement getting underway to make to stop the surgeries being as automatic as they are. 3 states and territories are beginning to move on this: Victoria, Tasmania and the ACT, which is a great sign of hope after all this time. So I think it's worth talking about that lack of equality, and that's sort of touched on that in this slide. So we've had some abolition of gay panic defence, which also can help trans people. Someone might say to me, "Oh, you're really a male and I'm being cheated into having gay sex," or things like that. Well, it can cover, therefore, all sexual orientation and gender identity. But certainly, we're still listed in the Psychologist, Psychiatrist, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, as gender dysphoria. Good news, though, was that the World Health Organization had no longer see us as having a mental health disorder. It's just something that exists in a way, which is fair. But as mentioned there, not enough on intersex, both in Australia and around the world. So worth holding space for that sort of inequity even within the communities we're talking about.
So, and just to again pick up on that lifetime of experiences. So Private Lives 3 was released in 2020, and this interviewed 6,835 participants, predominantly L, G and T, and they were asked in the previous 12 months about their experiences. And as you can see, there are still significantly high rates of abuse happening to these communities. I had a look back at Private Lives 2 to see what the difference was. And even though it was a smaller number of people that participated in Private Lives 2, so around 4,000, it was interesting to note that the discrimination and abuse had increased, even allowing for a larger number of people being included in Private Lives 3. And of particular note, that stood out for me, was that in the previous report, only 2.9% of people had reported a sexual assault, but in this report, it was 11.8%. So even allowing for a doubling, if you like, it's a significant increase of the experiences of assault and abuse and discrimination that LGBT, as I said, predominantly responded, have experienced. And of interesting note, in Private Lives 2, this wasn't addressed, but in Private Lives 3, we're starting to see refusal of service coming in as an issue. And obviously, the new discussions around the religious discrimination laws are going to play into that even further.
Yeah, and again, noting differential, whilst any refusal of service, of course, is unacceptable, and particularly under current laws, there's noting the things that just seem unthinkable, such as the law that's on the table in the New South Wales Parliament about stopping discussion of trans issues in school, which is relatively extreme. So, these things are happening. People just not getting the service they want from a service provider of a range of people. Yep.
Sally, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, so things that we also have to consider is in this day and age where we've got internet, greater communication, these are, I say seriously, these are amazing things like Zoom that can bring us together. We might not think about these, but days gone by, even as recently as the 90s or 2000s, there was what's called lateral violence across and within LGBTIQA plus communities. So we mentioned some of the biphobia that people face. That sadly can happen at times from elements of gay and lesbian. The Victoria's Pride March, the bi group first started marching in 2006, and every year up until 2016, we'd hear shouts from the crowd, and I will say content warning for biphobia, get off the fence, make up your mind. Sometimes we'd spot the people saying it and we knew who they were, and they were gay or lesbian. So the practical implications for that, if you've got, two people in an aged care setting and someone says, I'm bi, and you say, well, look, there's a gay couple over there. They might go, no, because they've had that experience. So always check in first before you introduce people to each other. Intersex people, still huge mistrust of health and medical care because of the surgeries that they were forced to have what they didn't really need, the covering up. Even 2 years ago, in Victoria, surgeons were refusing to supply the Victorian state government the number of intersex surgeries they were doing. So that doesn't help. Trans and gender diverse people, fear of losing access to services. So much of our accommodation, for example, is either or, men, women, or changing rooms, or whatever it is. Health outcomes, worse. The distress of facing discrimination and isolation and similar. It's going to run anyone down physically and mentally. Discrimination or even the perception or what might be considered indirect discrimination, where you go to a GP because you've, sprained your ankle when you're out walking or something, tripped over, and I walk in and say, oh, and they say, you're a trans person. Tell me your life story. No, I've really got this ankle that's sort of cartoon-like going, blah, blah, blah. And you don't really want to talk about trans at that point. And also people of passing, trying to blend in as heterosexual or cisgender is the term there, cis Latin for on the same side as, so assuming your gender meets expectations. And people have been sort of forced to blend in, and that takes stress as well when you can't be really someone you're not in a safe. When you're trying to be someone you're not in a safe, and it's not safe to be yourself. It takes a lot of energy. So, there's lots of things that, all other things being equal, mean big differences between LGBTIQA plus and cisgender, heterosexual, and sex characteristics fitting expectations.
Great. And I guess just picking up on one point there is that that feeling, particularly for Sally, I'm going to step in here, particularly for trans and gender diverse people, about having to be provide all the knowledge to the person providing services. So there's that constant feeling of having to educate everyone they come into contact with. So that's why it's so important that you already have that understanding and that education and that knowledge, so that you're not then putting that extra pressure on someone accessing your service and trying to get them to talk about their life story, which might not have any relevance at that point in time.
Yeah. I'm just going to throw one other in when we mention life stories. Just something to consider in this light, if people do not want to disclose who they are. You might, in an aged care setting, say to people, okay, today we're going to draw ourselves at 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old. Well, a trans person who is, to use our term, in stealth, so a trans woman who just wants to be a woman and doesn't want to talk about being trans, they're going to sit there and sort of have a huge rush of anxiety. So that's something that can talk when we're talking, life stories. So how can we make that inclusive? What music were you listening to at 5 years, 10 years, etc.? And at 5 years old, spout off Jimi Hendrix, and 10 years it'll be Skyhooks, and 15 years Cold Chisel, and on we go. But seriously, you've just made that a little more inclusive, and people will feel a bit more relaxed because anyone of any gender could be listening to that music. So, watch out for those little subtle things that could sneak in that we don't think about.
Fantastic. So how do we support elder LGBTIQA plus people? And I'm conscious that we're also getting close to time, so we'll speed things up a little bit. So obviously do work to be inclusive and communicate it. Let people know about what you're doing to be inclusive and how you're going about it and what you're doing. It's really important that people hear and know about it. There's no point you doing it and then waiting for people to come in and learn about it once they're there. That they need to be able to see that before they're thinking about accessing services or being involved in anything you're running.
Yeah, so very quickly, a rainbow sticker on a website is a good thing. That's the communication, but I think it starts with values and behaviours, and anyone can write up a value statement. It's how it's constantly reinforced. And I want to give credit here. I was working with Australia Post recently. They start every team meeting with their 4 values words. What a good idea. That's the sort of thing, if you really want to do diversity, keep repeating it and people will, get it into the system, so to speak. Sam.
Cool. Again, really important to have clear parameters around respect and safety for the person, around confidentiality and privacy of their information and on them and what they're telling you. Having that diversity of values and perceptions and personal experiences, recognizing and acknowledging that, and acknowledging that that's going to be within staff or within members of your community or within members of your group or organization, and continually working on that to reduce unconscious bias. And that's where you're not actually aware that you might be treating someone differently, but you do. And sometimes that needs to be called out and explained.
Yeah, and we all do. I acknowledge my privilege as someone who is white, non-Aboriginal, similar. I'm sure there are things I do not know or cannot understand. It's just best value about doing diversity, well, curiosity, just being open to learning, and we can all learn about other parts of diversity, including beyond our own sense of experience. Yep.
Great. And we've touched on some of this in previous slides, so I won't go through all of that. I think it's really important to note that people won't always disclose or come out, no matter how safe or inclusive you are, and that's okay. There shouldn't be an expectation that people have to. It's just accepting where people are up to and how comfortable they feel, and that if they choose not to, they choose not to. And I guess part of that is to, so often we've heard is, oh, I can tell that person is gay, or I can tell that person is intersex. Well, no, you can't. There's no external thing unless they're wearing a badge that states something that would help you identify someone in that way. So that's something to be really cautious about too, in terms of thinking, oh, well, I know they're gay and they haven't come out, but I'm going to make sure they get those services. Whereas they might not be, or they might not want to have those services. So something just to keep an eye on again.
Yep.
So just a few issues that came up during COVID. Sal, did you want to talk to?
Yeah, very quickly, people not getting the support they need because, all the support, so much of the support networks were set up in that sort of cis-normative lens, or even if partners were, just not just male and female, it's that whole, what happens if you have different support networks where you don't necessarily have a partner as such. I'm going to add in the plus here, people who might be quite open about having multiple partners, that they were forced maybe to have to choose between them, and how did they navigate that? Delays on trans surgeries not considered essential, or we know that they are. It's very distressing to have to constantly wait for it, and now there's a backlog. HIV trauma, this was something that, not my experience, but go back to the HIV situation in Australia of the 80s, early 90s. And people with HIV were shunned, the Grim Reaper ads, the whole thing. Yet here we all were in this sort of pandemic, we're all in this together and everyone's supposedly caring, rushed to do a vaccine. Where are we 40 years on? We still don't have an instant vaccine or something for HIV. Yes, medications have come a long way. Huge loss of employment in arts and hospitality, where a lot of rainbowish people sort of get their income from, and of course still not 100% back. And beyond Australia, some countries I heard of had a gendered approach to days out. So men were allowed out on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, women on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, no one on Sunday. Well, even if you regardless of how you look or what is on your documentation, that's going to lead to stress for trans and gender diverse people, just things that perhaps we don't think about. And also going beyond ageing, younger people perhaps being trapped in a home where their loved ones were not supportive and used the, wrong name, wrong pronouns, those sorts of things. But I suppose that could happen for anyone of any age. So lots of issues that really came in there.
Great, thanks, Sally. I suppose the other things you need to think around are intersectionality. So quite often when people are talking, people are still sort of tending to think around LGBTIQA plus people as white, middle class, of a particular age, young age, sort of, middle age, sorry, not middle age, young age, of particular abilities, and live in particular areas. And I think we need to be really sensitive to that and recognise that LGBTIQA plus people exist across all ages, all cultures, all diversities, all religious affiliations, disabilities, all job types. And we need to think about those intersectionalities, particularly where there might be that dual or even triple discrimination being experienced because of those other intersectionalities.
Yeah. I'll pick out two there just for examples. Neuroprocessing, how our brains process information. Percentage of whole population on the autism spectrum, 3%. Percentage of trans population with autism, 29% according to one survey. And that was youth. And a lot of older people may not have been recognised, whether medically or by themselves, as experiencing autism. So issues for communication. And some people on the spectrum take things literally. So plain language is really good. Please sit down rather than take a seat or something like that. Or if I can be a little dry humoured, a colleague of mine whose child is on the spectrum tells of this, used to tell the child when the child was younger, put your shoes and socks on. And the child, unfortunately, would put the shoes on first, then try to put the socks over. And now says, hey, socks on first, then shoes. These sorts of things. Sex workers. 2/3 of sex workers are parts of LGBTIQA plus communities, most likely LGBTQ. So a lot of people in the past, sex workers may not have had access to super, those sorts of things, because it was cash in hand, faced a lot of discrimination. So definitely another double whammy, but not my lived expertise. And groups like Vixen Collective in Victoria and Scarlet Alliance nationally are good groups to talk to. Yep. And I've noticed we do have a question from Bryony. Let's try and zap through the slides and then we'll come to that, Sam.
Okay. Did you want to talk about the case studies, or we'll just keep going?
Actually, I can link this in.
Okay.
So specific issues. One case study that comes to mind was of a person, I'll just say, who was put in aged care and was entered into aged care as a man. And the poor staff in this setting got a huge shock when they went to shower the person, pulled back the covers and saw a female body. And then the whole story came out. This older trans woman was, and I should have said content warning here, I will say content warning at least at this point for elder abuse, transphobia, similar. The trans woman had been in a relationship with a male who died. Adult child took over care and had never accepted her parents' gender identity, and said, if you want me to look after you, you'll go into aged care as a man, you'll use your old male name, and if you don't, you'll never see your grandkids again. And so that's how this happened. Now, the staff did exactly the right thing. Their duty of care is to the older person. They treated the person as female, except when the parent was around. She had the adult child, adult child hardly ever came anyway and never brought the grandkids. Unfortunately, just as they were trying to get this through a civil administrative appeals tribunal, the person began to develop advanced dementia and couldn't give consent. So these are the sort of specific issues in terms of elder abuse that could happen, where it's just generally abusive behaviour, misuse of power, I suppose, is the overarching theme, but also separating couples other than male or female, whereas you might not separate a male and female couple who want to be together in aged care. Those sorts of things are just a couple of things, sort of not, I suppose it's elder abuse, but a form of discrimination I got a call one day from an older male. His partner had died in one of those retirement village where it's a 99-year-old lease, 99-year lease, and the wasn't the surviving partner wasn't given access to the room, wasn't sure what to do. And I said, well, when other people sadly die, who gets access to them? Oh, nieces, nephews, grandkids. It's like, well, there's your answer. So it became discrimination, and they sorted it out. So these are some of the things that are happening, but it is just about being aware, building that rapport so people can disclose as quickly, or something, whether they actually say I'm trans or I'm gay isn't the thing. So yeah, other resources, well, always get in touch with us. Our web addresses will be going up when this presentation goes up, but mine is very simple, sallygoldner.com. There we are, and my email address, and there's Sam's. Lots of great organisations, LGBTIQA, LGBTIQ plus Health Australia, formerly the Health Alliance, trans organisations there's a whole heap, Bi Alliance Victoria, Intersex Human Rights, there's a whole heap of bodies. And look, I always say on any presentation, this doesn't end now, please stay in touch with us. That's what we're here for. We see ourselves very much as networking and links in the network, and it's really important that you stay in touch with us. We can also perhaps come and do more training in your particular workplace and do a detailed, more detail, in the words of Back to the Future, if only we had more time. But, I hope that we've at least given an overview and got people thinking today. And there's all sorts of courses, and also the LGBTI Health Alliance coordinates aged care training, which is largely subsidised in each state and territory, so they can assist, or we can point you there as well. So there's plenty of stuff in there. You don't have to reinvent wheels, I think is what we'd say. There's plenty of experience, and that's where all of this comes in. And then the bottom line is it will change lives and maybe even save lives, which is really awesome. And I have to say, for me personally, the fact that we have 45 people here today, when even 5 years ago, people were still not even coming and asking, or maybe 10 or 15, is incredibly heartening, and is personally sort of cathartic in a way, just to know that people want to ask and learn. Yay.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much, Sam and Sally. I don't think we've got much time for questions, but you did a great job of answering them as you went through your presentation. So thank you very much for that.
Pleasure.
Everyone,
thank
please
you.
Nice compliments.
in thanking Sam and Sally with your clap reactions.
Thank you.
This is how we do a round of applause nowadays.
And I'm conscious that we didn't get through all the slides, so more than welcome if you want to share them so people can see some of the other issues that we didn't quite touch on. So that's
yes, we'll be putting a recording of this presentation and your slides up on the NARI website later this week.
Cool.
Another note for everyone, we're currently running an evaluation survey of our NARI education program. So I would invite you all to copy the link that Esther will be putting in the chat shortly to complete the survey. It will be closing soon, so please go ahead and do that. Next week, we're going to be hearing from Professor Sharon Naismith, who will be presenting Sleep, Aging and Neurodegenerative Disease, Optimizing Sleep for a Healthy Brain and Mind. So please join us next Tuesday at midday, and thank you all for attending our Seminars in Aging program.